Dave Middlebrook with The Law and You, and I am so excited about today's episode because we're going to be discussing something that impacts everyone, and that is estate planning. Now, if you haven't watched the first episode in our series on estate planning, I would encourage you to go watch that first episode because we did about a 40,000 foot flyover, but today we're going to get into some depth with my good friend, Max Bishop. Max, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Max, tell us, for those watching, what is estate planning?
Estate planning is really two things. It's number one, taking care of each other while we're alive. We have to do things that plan for disability, and those are usually done through what we call powers of attorney. There's a durable power of attorney for finances, and there's a medical power of attorney for medical decisions.
Okay. And why is it important?
Because you have to make sure that you're planning for what we're doing while we're alive. It's one thing to leave property when you pass, but you've got to get to that stage first. And a lot of people don't realize, hey, I'm much more likely to be disabled before I'm deceased than just to be deceased.
Okay. Now, I'm going to pause here for a moment and just remind everybody, like I do in every episode, and that is we're in Texas. Look at the flag over my shoulder. Number one. And number two, your law in whatever state you're in may be a little bit different, but this happens to be an area of law that's pretty well settled. So I think the concepts are going to be applicable to almost everyone, right?
The laws here have been around really since the time of the American Revolution. It's going to be very hard to see too much variance in what the various states have compared to what we're talking about today.
Okay. So good concepts that we can learn and they can be applicable and help people to begin to process this really critically important issue, right?
It is critical because everybody lives, and at some point everybody gets sick, and at some point everybody passes away.
Okay. Now, we're going to work really hard, folks, to avoid legalese. Yeah. And you help me and I'll help you.
Okay.
But this happens to be a particular area of the law that there's some magic words.
There
right?
are, and it's a highly technical area of law, and it really requires people who do it a lot to be proficient in it. So we're going to do our best to keep things simple.
And so, again, you've been doing this for how long?
29 years.
And how many estate plans do you think you've done? Just guess.
2,500.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, I have I have 5 objectives, really. I'd like folks to, having watched this episode, I'd like it to be kind of the setup for the next episode. And what I mean by that is I want folks to walk away and have some understanding of some core concepts.
Okay.
These are the ones that I've come up with, and I'm sure there'll be some more we unearth as we move forward. But that is 1, estate planning documents. 2, executor.
Sure.
3, beneficiaries. 4, probate and the probate process. And then 5, advanced medical directives.
Okay.
Okay, so let's dive in. Are you cool?
I'm ready.
Okay, let's go. So why do I need an estate plan? I mean, I think if I'm watching, that's what I'd be thinking, that these lawyers, they just want to do a bunch of legal work, et cetera. Why do I need an estate plan?
No matter who you are, no matter how much money you have, you need some semblance of an estate plan. Why? You have things like personal effects that are subject to probate. You have a home. 2/3 of Americans, where they live, they own it. They may need to deal with accounts, things that don't have beneficiaries named. Or you may decide that you want to make sure that you provide for your loved ones in a special way. You may decide you need to leave things to them in trust.
Now, if I just choose not to have an estate plan, that's no big deal, right? I mean...
Well, that's okay because the state will have an estate plan for you.
So, the state in which you live, if I live in Texas, state of Texas, our legislature has written a plan for me.
That's right.
And am I going to like that plan?
You are not going to like that plan.
Why is that?
Because that plan is the same plan for every person who passes away in the state of Texas.
Oh.
Whatever your circumstances are, whatever your family needs, has absolutely nothing to do with what the state legislature decided.
Yeah. Now, I will tell you, Max, I've experienced resistance in my law practice. I've been doing this over 30 years now.
Yeah.
30, can't believe it. But With the resistance that I've experienced is that people don't necessarily want to talk about this for several reasons. One, I think, is because it has to do with their death or the death of a loved one.
Right.
Two, they really don't want to talk about money necessarily with their loved ones.
Right.
And three, and probably the biggest hurdle that I've experienced, is that folks get caught up on the issue of who's going to take care of the kids.
Yep.
Okay, so tell me about your experience.
My experience has been a lot like yours. People either A, they're nervous about going into a law office, just like they'd be nervous in going to a dental office. We understand that. One of the things you have to do as the attorney is you have to get people to come out of their shell. You have to get them to tell you exactly what they want. When I start a meeting, a will planning meeting, a trust planning meeting, whatever it is, I flat out ask them, I say, what do you want to do? Mm-hmm. My job is to find out what you want to do and then put it together for you. That's what I do.
So just a hypothetical here. Let's say that my wife and I have kids, and I think my brother's really good at taking care of money.
Okay.
But my wife, under no circumstance, wants my brother raising our kids.
Sure.
What do you do in a situation like that? Because I'm okay. I think her sister's great at raising kids. So my brother's good at money. Her sister's good at kids.
Well, the first thing I would say to you is no matter what, follow your gut. If you're saying that your brother is better at taking care of money, then you know what? You're probably right. If your wife is saying her sister is better at taking care of the kids, you know what? She's probably right too. There's absolutely nothing wrong in having one person in charge of the money and one person in charge of the kids.
Okay. And so what are the elements? I mean, these terms can kind of be overwhelming. I mean, what are the practical elements of working through and putting together an estate plan?
Whenever we do an estate plan, we have to have first what we call dispositive documents. That means you're going to have a will, or you're going to have a living trust or an inter vivos trust.
Whoa! A bunch of let's start with dispositive. What does that word mean?
Dispositive means that it's capable of passing assets on the day of your passing.
It's the same root word like disposing of?
Exactly.
Okay, dispositive.
You bet.
And okay, so the next issue is keep going.
Well, you've got to have the will or the trust, and number two, you've got to have documents which plan for your disability. One of the things that we found out in the last 20 to 30 years is that people understand that they need a will, but they don't understand that they need to plan for what happens if they get sick. We have in this state, we have two separate powers of attorney. We have a durable power of attorney and we have a medical power of attorney that people have to do to really have a complete estate plan.
Okay, and so a complete estate plan, if someone's thinking to themselves, well, I have a will, is that an estate plan?
It is a partial estate plan,
okay,
but it is not an estate plan that works until after you're gone.
Okay, and so there's elements of there's things that you can do at a bank, for example, yep, and payable on death accounts and all. Talk about that for a minute.
You could, if you wanted to, go to your bank and say, I want to make sure that this bank account designates my wife as my beneficiary. And if my wife doesn't survive, we want to name a contingent beneficiary. And the bank will do that for you.
Okay.
And in most cases, that works very well.
Okay. But I've heard you say before that there's some confusion that can come in, because it seems to me like the legislature in Texas in particular has legislated some things that maybe would work in like a will, right, for folks that don't have one, right? These payable on death accounts, et cetera. And I believe I've heard you say before, let's try to keep it clean, right, because those kind of instruments can sometimes cause a problem.
They can cause huge problems.
Okay, tell me about it.
Let's suppose that you named your wife as a beneficiary. Well, at the time, your wife passed away or you're now divorced.
Okay.
That's a problem. We deal with a lot of people in estate planning where there's a situation where they did estate planning before, but they divorced the person that they were doing estate planning with. So if you've named a spouse on your bank account and you are now divorced from that spouse, that beneficiary designation here in Texas is void. Okay. So now you haven't named a beneficiary at all.
And does that kick you back to being...
It kicks you back to probate.
Okay. Yeah, and so that kicks you also back to the will that the state...
Absolutely.
Okay. And there's a term, when you die and you don't have a will, what is that term?
That's a term called intestate.
Okay, intestate, dying intestate without a will.
And when you die with a will, you are testate.
Okay. Now, testamentary documents, I've heard you use that term, and we've talked about wills.
Yep.
I've heard you talk about living trust.
That's right.
Explain that to me.
A trust is simply, the best way to describe it, a trust is a box. It's a legal box where you have control over the flaps and you get to decide what goes in the box and what comes out of the box. The idea behind the trust is that the trust owns your assets so that at the time of your passing, they're not subject to probate because you don't own them, the trust did.
Okay. Now, one of the words that we talked about, we were going to define early on, we haven't gotten there yet, but I think it's time to talk about that, and that is beneficiaries.
You bet.
What's a beneficiary?
A beneficiary is somebody who is named in a will or a trust, and they are a beneficiary if they survived you and the will is admitted to probate or the trust owns assets at your passing.
And that root word, I think, is you benefit from the will, right? You're a beneficiary.
That's right.
All right. So beneficiaries. And we talked about executor. Have we gotten there yet?
Let's talk about executors.
Okay, tell me about an executor.
An executor is somebody who is appointed in your will and manages your estate at your passing. The executor does not have any power, though, until after you are gone and your will is admitted to probate and approved by a judge.
Okay. Now, again, just hearkening back on my experience over the years and talking to folks and talking these hurdles that people have a hard time getting over. One is who's going to take care of the kids, take care of finances, but another is who's going to be the executor.
Sure.
Okay, so what do you do? How do you help people there?
We find out from people, okay, who do you trust the most with money? Who is the most money savvy person you know? Who is the person who dealt the most with banks or life insurance companies or annuity companies?
Okay.
These are the kind of people who, if you trust them, are the kind of people that work very well in doing an executorship.
Okay, so in my life, the person I trust the most with my money is my wife.
Okay.
Okay, so I would make her in my will the executor of my will.
And that's very typical.
Okay.
Spouses normally name each other first.
Okay. And if they don't, there's probably another issue that we can talk about in another episode.
You bet. Way down the pipe.
Yeah, way down the pipe. But okay, so what if, however, my wife and I die, hypothetically, God forbid, but hypothetically we were to die simultaneously or in a short period of time? How does that work?
Well, if you have a will, typically you'll name an executor. And if you've really done some thinking about it and your lawyer has been able to help you enough, you're going to have what's called an alternate or a contingent executor.
Okay.
These are people who act in the event that you and your wife are both gone and can't help each other.
Okay. And if the issue of disability, does that come up? I mean,
not in a will, because the will doesn't take effect until after you're gone.
Okay. So what about on the trust side?
When you do a trust, what you're basically saying is, we're going to create the box. We're going to name ourselves as trustees. We're going to be the people who manage the box. And we're going to put stuff inside the box. When you have a trust, you name a trustee, and then you name an alternate trustee, so that if you're not able to do it, if your spouse is not able to do it, you have somebody who can carry out the terms of the trust.
Okay. Now, I want to go back and talk about wills for a moment, and I assume the validity of a trust, is it have the same issues as the validity of a will?
No.
Okay, why is that?
When a trust is created, it is not subject to anything that a judge does. The idea behind a trust is to keep stuff out of probate.
Okay.
When you have a trust, the trust is created. It's usually funded while you're alive, which means we're putting stuff in it. And whatever's in it is not subject to probate at the time of your passing. So the way that a trust is created and the way that a will is created are two totally different processes.
So help people watching, myself, help us clarify the issue of here's a will, here's a trust, but they're different.
A trust, as I said, is the box. It's got flaps on it, and you put stuff into it while you're alive.
So you mean like a cardboard box?
Absolutely.
It's a treasure chest,
It could
whatever.
be a wooden box. It's just a box. The will has absolutely nothing to do with transferring assets, and the will only takes effect after you're gone.
Okay.
So it's a timing issue. When do you want this estate plan to take effect? Do you want it to take effect while you're alive, or do you want it to take effect after you've passed?
Okay, and if I say to you, I really would like to have this happen now and be more involved in this planning,
Yep.
and you would say, okay, well, you're a candidate for a trust.
Absolutely.
And so my wife and I would come in and sit down and visit with you, and what are the questions you're going to ask us?
Well, one of the questions I would ask is, how much real estate do you own? If you have a lot of real estate, typically those are folks that are more interested in trusts. If you have a potential for disability, if your family has a history of some type of medical disability, we would talk about doing a trust for you.
Okay, why?
Because when you're disabled, it becomes more difficult to manage assets.
Okay.
One of the things that the trust does is it allows you and your spouse to manage assets even if one of you is disabled without worrying about powers of attorney.
Okay, and you said a lot of real estate. We live in Texas, so
There's a lot of real
there's
estate.
a lot
here.
of real estate, and people that own a lot of real estate. But if somebody comes in and there's like, hey, we own a home, a single family residence, is that?
Typically, I'm not thinking that they're usually a good candidate for a trust. Now, if they come back to me and say, Max, we own a home here in Texas, but we also own a home in Arkansas, then I'm going to tell them you are a slam dunk candidate for a trust.
You know, you and I worked on a case together a couple of years ago, and I'll never forget talking to this gentleman, sweet man, and he said, look, I don't have anything. I've just got my little house over here, et cetera. And I began to talk to him, and he said, well, then I've got that vacation home in Hawaii.
Exactly.
And then I've got that other home in Colorado. And I'm like, well, that's a lot of real estate, right?
It is. And he was the kind of a client who was a prototypical trust client.
Okay.
He had a property here, and he had property in Hawaii, which is a probate nightmare. And
Why is that?
Because Hawaiian laws are different from just about everybody else's laws.
Okay.
And he had a Colorado estate, a Colorado property, and the Colorado property was another prime instance of where he needed to be putting stuff inside of a trust. He wasn't looking at one probate, he was looking at three. He was looking at one here in Texas, he was looking at one in Hawaii, and then he was looking at one in Colorado.
Okay. I think I want to spend just a few moments talking about the validity of a will. Okay, so we're going to go back and talk about wills for a moment, but the validity of a will. So there's a couple of types of wills. There's a holographic will.
Sure.
And tell us what that means.
A holographic will is a will that you sit down on a pad and handwrite.
Okay.
You say, I, John Doe, hereby bequeath all of my remaining assets to Mary Doe. I hereby name my brother, Brad Doe, as the executor of my estate, and you sign it, and that's it.
Okay.
That's a holographic
Not
will.
ideal.
Far from ideal.
Okay. Secondly, a term that you hear a lot is codicil.
Okay.
So you've got a will, and then you do a codicil. And again, not ideal, but tell us about what a codicil is.
All a codicil does is amend your will. So if you did a will, say, in 2004 and your family circumstances have changed, you can execute a codicil here in 2021, which amends the provisions of the will that have changed. If you were gone, we would file both the will and the codicil for probate.
Okay. And the authenticity of the will. I mean, if I had a lawsuit, a young baby lawyer, and we had to go have a jury trial over an issue about whether or not this gentleman who had passed, whether his will was authentic or it had been forged by one of his three siblings.
Okay.
Okay. And the other two siblings were convinced that that was the case. So is there something that the law has developed that allows you to get over that issue?
Well, here in Texas, we've developed a whole estates code that does that.
Okay.
Bottom line, the law around the validity of wills is as old as the American Revolution. What you have to have a valid will is a signature by the person creating the will. Mm-hmm. In almost every instance, it has to be witnessed. And in many cases, you can have special state-granted language called self-proving language, whereby you can prove up a will in a probate court without finding the witnesses.
So the court's just going to look at it and go, well, that was done correctly, so it's proven to be true.
That's exactly right.
Now, everybody that's watching is probably thinking, well, that's all interesting and good. Many people are thinking, I can just go online and create a will. Good idea?
Bad idea.
Tell me why.
Most people who grab their forms off of the internet or they grab their forms out of a form book probably don't really know what they're doing in terms of how to make it actually work. If you said, I have found the absolute perfect will form online and all I have to do is fill in the blanks, you're not taking things into account like, well, I'm going to provide for my spouse, but how do I want to do that if my spouse gets remarried? Mm-hmm. I've got 3 children. I love all of my children, but one of them has special challenges. How am I going to provide for that child's challenges when I'm gone?
Or I don't want to provide for that child.
That's exactly right.
And that happens a lot.
There are a lot of people who come to me and say, I love my children, but one of them, I can't leave any property to him because he'll just waste it.
Okay.
And I see that all the time.
Now, I would ask you this question, and I would ask anybody that's thinking about going online and doing this, is it's really not that expensive, is it, to get a professionally drawn, attorney-approved will?
We do wills, and we'll do this year over 100 will packages. Okay. And we will charge less than $1,000 in every instance.
Okay.
This type of planning, this kind of work for us, it's very turnkey. When you're walking in and meeting your attorney should be quoting you typically a turnkey price. This kind of work is not difficult. And here in Texas, we've got it down to a real science about what you want and meshing that with the forms we have.
Which is not necessarily estate planning, right? I mean, a trust, for example, right. But it is estate planning in the sense you're getting a will package and you're getting your basic things taken care of.
That's absolutely right. We're not talking about trusts here at all. There's many people who come to us who don't need a trust, sure. So we don't give them one.
Okay, let me go back to my list of things. Estate planning docs, we talked about executor, beneficiaries. We've talked a little bit about probate, and we're going to get into it deeper in the next episode because it's kind of got a boogeyman aspect to it, right? Probate can be really complicated and expensive.
And it can be the boogeyman.
But I'm going to skip over and ask you about what the 5th term that I wanted to make sure folks had an opportunity to hear from us on, and that is an advanced medical directive. What is that?
An advanced medical directive is when you are telling the world that I am appointing an agent, I am asking a doctor, I am telling a doctor, this is what I want in terms of my medical care should I become disabled. Now, in Texas, we have 3 documents. We have what we call the medical power of attorney. We have what's called a living will or a directive to physicians. And we have what's called a DNR order, which stands, of course, for do not resuscitate. The way I explain this to clients is I use the sauce analogy. I will say that the medical power of attorney is like ketchup. It's a very common form.
Condiments. We're talking condiments.
We're talking condiments. It's a very common form, and it's very easy to digest.
Okay.
It's what everybody gets. You're naming an agent to make any medical decision for you that you could not have made. Then we have what I call a living will. A living will is like picante sauce. It's just a little hotter than the ketchup. The living will is where you're telling people, doctor, if the following circumstances are met, I want you to pull the plug. I don't even want to worry about a medical agent doing that. I just want you to pull the plug. Then the 3rd document is called the DNR, the do not resuscitate, which says, if my heart stops beating, doctor, you're supposed to walk away. Now, the DNR, in my mind, is the Tabasco sauce. It's the hottest sauce you can possibly eat. Of course, we're here in Texas, so a lot of people know what I'm talking about. Right. But it really does vary. Most of our clients only need a medical power, and I will try to talk them out of a living will or a DNR order. But there are some people who definitely need a living will or a DNR order.
You know, it was interesting. Recently, I was, and I have a personal experience with this and why it's, I think, important to let family make those final decisions for a loved one.
Yeah.
And I was making this explanation to a potential client, and she said, well, I don't want to put that on my family. And so I said, well, you don't want to just hand the ball off to doctors, do you? And she said, well, I really don't want to put that on my family. So tell me what your reaction is to that.
I represent a lot of doctors in my practice, and I've never met a doctor who had anything resembling a rational point of view about this who wanted to be the one pulling that plug. Doctors don't want to do it. And there's a lot of good reasons that you can all imagine what those would be. I think that in the long run, it's better for your family to be in control of this process. If you have family members making this decision, they know you better than that doctor ever will, and they know what you want. And they're much more willing to carry it out than even a doctor would.
Sure.
A doctor's just looking at a piece of paper and saying, okay, I'm supposed to pull the plug. Your loved ones are saying, this is what he would have wanted.
Yeah. You know, and in our personal experience, as it related to my mother, we were very glad that we had the opportunity as a family to come together and to accept, you know, we weren't disregarding what the doctors were saying, obviously, but to process it and to have an opportunity to pray over it and think about it and then come to the decision. It was very comforting, frankly.
I think for the medical power, particularly, you're in control of the process and you're in control of the timing of the process. You're giving your agent the right to make whatever decisions need to be made. On the other hand, your agent can say, okay, I've got to get all the family together. I've got to make sure they all understand what's going on. And I have to get them ready for what's about to happen.
Okay. Well, the final thing, and I want this to be the setup for the next episode, but we've touched upon it and we've kind of alluded to it, but the probate process, what does that mean?
Probate is where you're taking an estate, if you don't have a will, or you're taking a will, and you're putting it in front of a judge, and you're asking the judge to bless it.
Okay.
The judge literally has to go like this and say, yes, this is what we're going to do with this will, and we approve it. The probate process also allows you to handle any debts of the decedent, meaning the person who passed away may have debts and we need to get those paid. And then we need to distribute the assets. That's what probate courts do, and they do it day in and day out.
Okay, so just to be clear, you said if they don't have a will, you have to go to court.
That's exactly right.
And if you do have a will, you still have to go to court. Is there any benefit then? I mean, in terms of from people who are like going, I still have to go to court. So
I will tell you that when we don't have a will, our fees in our office essentially double in probate because there's a lot more work to be done. When there's a will and it's approved up in court, the cost of probating that estate basically gets cut in half.
Wow.
And I'm looking at what we do on a daily basis and what we have to charge people who don't have wills compared to what we have when we have a will. It's just so much simpler when you have the will. And by the way, the judge wants you to have a will. The judge wants you to walk into that court and say, you know, where's the will? And you're handing him or her the will, and there's a big smile on their face because they know they don't have to deal with much. They're just blessing a piece of paper and they're moving on.
And to just remind everybody, the reason this is complex and the reason there's all these moving parts is because in the course of one's life, generally you're going to accumulate stuff.
Yep.
And if you pass, you don't have a will, your last will and testament, then the court's going to come in and try to clean it up so that life can move on and there'll be clean title and there'll be all these issues addressed. But they're going to do it with the will that the legislature has written in Texas or whatever state you're in, right?
And that judge is going to tell you, hey, Counselor, I am stuck with what the state legislature gave me. I don't agree with what they did. I don't agree with the way that things go, but you and I are both stuck with it, and we're moving on.
So give me an example of a bad outcome.
All right. We have Mary Doe. Mary Doe has 3 children. She has Bobby, she has Chloe, and she has Andy. Bobby and Chloe are great kids, and Andy's a great kid, but Andy is special needs.
Okay.
Andy, his 1/3 of the estate should not be provided to him because he has needs which will keep him from understanding what he's received, and it will keep him from managing it. Well, the estate still goes 1/3 to Andy.
Okay.
It's it.
Okay.
And it has absolutely nothing to do with Andy's state of mind. It has absolutely nothing to do with what Andy wants to do. It has to do with what the law is. And until you have a will, you can't plan for Andy.
Okay. That's a perfect way to end, I think, this episode, where we're talking, this is episode 2 in our estate planning series, where we're talking about basic fundamental core principles and concepts you need to understand, because we're going to move on to the next episode and really get into some of the details of how this works. But it's so important, isn't it? I mean, to take this time and to provide for your family. It's kind of a joke, but it's not. And one of the things in episode 1 that Dustin Gaines said, words to the effect of, this is what Jesus said to do at the Last Supper.
Yep.
And I'm like, what? He said, yeah, it was the Last Supper where he expressed his will. He was going to shed his blood for us. And we got a New Testament, last will testament.
Yeah. Well, he covered the bases.
Yeah. And it is important. It's important for your family. It's important for all of us to take the time and not be afraid. And that's really what we're trying to accomplish here, is for you to have peace of mind so that you can engage a professional to help you through this process. And if you have any questions about this episode of The Law and You, then there's going to be an email address at the bottom. You can certainly send me an email, and we'll take a look at it about this topic or any others you would like for us to address. And I want to thank you, my friend, for coming and spending your time. I know this is your passion, and you're great at doing it, and we're so glad to have you here.
Thank you very much.
You
Appreciate it.